So we're now looking at the sections of parts of powers of the nefesh, which Rambam says there are 5, and he's going to give a brief description of each one, which, from our point of view, is really the last 2 that are most important. And then he's going to describe how the nefesh is related to the body and to the person as a whole. And it's going to be a double relationship, which we'll have to try to describe carefully, and I'll have to give you a model of, so you'll be able to understand it, because there's a certain subtlety in it. Yesterday we started with the the lowest element in the soul. Now that's in Hebrew, or the Hebrew translation of the Arabic is called zan. I translate it as nutrition, but he says that although it may appear to you that the functions of this area of the human being are so similar to comparable functions, let's say, of animals, that you may be hypnotized into thinking that they must have a common basis, they must have a common reality, they must have a common mechanism that makes them operate, which would be definitely the modern attitude. Rambam says this is completely wrong, that the nefesh of each species has its own identity, its own structure, and the fact that human beings grow and horses grow doesn't mean there's one mechanism that makes them all grow. That's just not true. Human beings grow because of the nefesh that gives identity to the human reality. And the horse grows because of the nefesh that gives reality to the horse reality. And although in both cases the body expands, the way in which it expands, the mechanism by which it expands, is not the same. I pointed out yesterday, for example, the emotional state of a person can have an effect on his digestive system, which will then have an effect on his growth. Emotional state of a human being is part of the mental capacities of a human being, which doesn't have a parallel in lower animals. So that's just an indication of the idea that even though you see processes which are similar on the surface, it doesn't mean the underlying mechanism by which they take place is the same mechanism. Now, he identifies the functions of this part of the soul, and it goes beyond what I called yesterday nutrition. And he says, in fact, there are several involved in nutrition, that is to say, taking things from the environment and ingesting them and digesting them and excreting the things that are not necessary for the body. And then there's growth. And then there's reproduction. And there's management of the interior elements in the body so that they can be correctly positioned and organized to do the things that they need to do. So if I would give a rough description of this part of the soul, I would say that it is what's behind individual survival and species survival. These processes are necessary for the individual human or the individual horse or whatever it is to survive, and also, since it includes reproduction, it's necessary for the species to survive. This is base level necessities for survival. And he says, analyzing all of these functions, knowing how they work and when they work, and what's necessary for them and how they interact with one another, all of that is necessary for the basis of being a medical doctor. And he was a medical doctor, but and he's not going to expand on that anymore. Then there's the part of the soul that's responsible for sensation. And he says this articulates itself into the five famous types of senses: sight, hearing, aroma, smell, taste, and touch. And of course, this is spread out through the body as a whole. And he doesn't have much more to say about that. And of course, this functionally we have in common with animals. But when you think the extent to which thought controls and manages sensation, so to a certain extent that operates with animals as well, but the kinds of thoughts that a human being has are worlds away from the kinds of thoughts that animals have. So Rav Dessler gives the example that you give a newspaper to 10 people, and they're told to read the whole newspaper from page 1 to page 60, and then afterward ask them what they remember. You'll get very different stories, because what you remember depends upon what you're interested in. Each one of them read all the words. The eyes saw all the words. The shapes of the letters went into everyone's brain. But the impression that it made on the person depends upon the interest of the person. So that's going to control what you see. When you scan your eyes over surfaces. So that's sensation. Now, the Chelik HaMadama, I spoke yesterday about similarity and conceptualization. So Rambam here gives a definition. What I want to point out is that his definition is common. It's something which many agreed upon, but it presupposes what I told you yesterday. Here he says, when your senses deliver to you experiences of the world around you, different types of experiences, each one, a different dimension for each sense. And those experiences make an impression on your memory. You remember colors and shapes and motion and sounds and aromas and tastes and feels. And this Koach HaMadama is, so to speak, the manager of those sensations and memories. It makes them accessible to memory, and also can associate them and combine them in creative ways. So first of all, obviously, if you don't associate the taste of the strawberry with the vision of the strawberry, you're not going to get many strawberries. Or if you don't associate the sound of the trumpet with the vision of the trumpet, you're not going to learn to play an instrument. So there have to be associations whereby you can learn what sensations from what senses are related to, help you predict and help you control the sensations from other senses. And then he says, when you can use this ability to make combinations that have never been experienced, and which might or might not be possible. It's capable of making combinations which are also impossible, and making the combinations in your mind, you may not know what's possible and what isn't possible. This can lead you to investigate. It might lead you to try to invent. So, could there be a grass that tastes like a strawberry? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe it's impossible. First thing you think is, could there be? And then you think, well, maybe I should look for it. And maybe if I crossed different species of plants, I could bring out one that had it. Maybe, who knows? And interestingly, the example that he gives of this part of the mind putting together a picture of something that in fact is impossible is a metal ship flying in the air. Now, some people say, yeah, too bad you didn't know about airplanes. Of course, an airplane isn't a metal ship flying in the air. It's a metal ship with a very special kind of motor and energy source. If you had asked the Rambam, maybe there are energy sources that could make it fly, I think his answer would be, maybe. I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about this ship here, the way it is here, floating in the water, flying in the air. And he's right. That thing will not fly in the air. It's too heavy to fly in the air. So that is an impossibility. Now, we face this all the time, and in the Gemara Nebuchim, he says something very profound. He says, I wish someone could tell me what faculty is it by which a person determines what is possible. He doesn't say what faculty determines what's impossible, but he asks what faculty determines that something's possible. Impossible is something which at least often can be determined. If you think about it, meditate on it, and it ends up being a contradictory description, it's impossible. If you learn something about the way the world works, like the idea of the metal ship flying in the air, also you learn it is impossible. Is it possible? Is there such a thing as learning that something's possible? That's a learning and knowing it's possible, period? Not being afraid that later it'll be discovered that it's impossible? Rambam worries about that, and to this day we're also worried about it. Until, let's say, 120 years ago, it was known that random molecular motion produces heat, it is heat, and things move faster or slower, and they get slower and slower, and the question was raised, what happened when they stop? And there were investigations to determine maybe hydrogen will become a solid when the molecules stop moving. And it turns out, according to quantum mechanics, they can't stop. Stopping is physically impossible. That's a surprise. Why not? Goes faster, goes slower. Slow it down, put some tar on the road, put them in a clamp, hold them still. According to quantum mechanics, that's absolutely impossible. Molecules cannot be held absolutely still. So it turns out something which seemed quite natural. We asked about it, we tried to investigate it. Surprise, surprise, we were talking about something which couldn't happen anyway. Is there anything that could determine that something's possible without threat of later discoveries undoing it and showing that it's impossible? The Rambam wonders about it, and he says, I wish somebody could explain to me what that would be, and we don't have it today either. Even in logic, since logic is non-computable, there's always the possibility that what you've written harbors a contradiction and you didn't see it, because there's no way to check all possible contradictions. At any rate, so you have here this ability of putting things together. But of course, if you're going to put a thing together, let's say metal and ship and floating in the ocean, you've already got to have what I called yesterday a quality space or a definition of similarity. Otherwise, you think of the metal ship, and the next time you think of it, you were thinking of a cucumber, because what makes it and what makes it different from a cucumber? If you don't have qualities that enable you to identify things, you can't think about it more than once. It's just things flash by, and other things, and more stuff flashes by, and there's no way to determine whether it's the same thing again or is something different. So all of this has to have underlying it a similarity measure, which enables you to determine what the relevant qualities are, and that's what this element of the human being does. So this is an essential feature of creativity. In creativity, one very simplistic description of how new things are discovered is, first of all, you exercise this ability, which in English is sometimes called the imagination, to think up something new, but then you have to exercise your ability of criticism and analysis to find out whether it's possible, and then if it's possible, is it practical? Is it something which you can accomplish and get, or something that you can't get? All that has to be done in order to end up with a really new contribution. So that's the Koach Madama. And Mary, you had a question?
Yeah, about that quality of this of seeing the possibilities. Is it that it's problematic that there's like some sort of until like in like if it's seen from, I mean, we can know what it can be eventually, right? Is it that one of the reasons why it's concerning, because there's like some sort of open end to it?
Not quite sure what you're asking. Let me give you another example. Could there be a 6-inch long mosquito? Mosquito whose size is 6 inches long?
Yes.
You say yes. You say yes. I mean, why not, right?
Yeah.
There's really big ones. Well, in fact, it is impossible. Why is it impossible? Because mosquitoes, like many insects, breathe through their skin. They have pores in their skin through which they take in oxygen. Now, when you increase the size of a physical object, the volume goes up as the cube of the diameter, whereas the surface area goes up as the square of the diameter. So the bigger thing it is, the less surface area it has per volume. Get to a certain point, there just isn't enough access to oxygen to nourish the whole volume of the object. So mosquitoes have physically built in a certain limitation in size. They can't be that big. You might change their structure entirely to have long, thin tendrils which take in oxygen. But I'm talking about the mosquito the way it's structured today. So you don't know that until you know how they function. Or, for example, can there be a human being 100 feet tall? Well, it turns out that his bones will break because the thickness of the bones doesn't keep up with the weight of the total body, and the tensile strength of the bones won't support it. So a human being can't be that big. So when you think, well, gee, I can picture it, 100 feet tall. That's a picture, all right, but it's not a picture of something that's possible. It's only a picture of something that's impossible. Yeah.
I agree with you, Rabbi. And when can we say that evidence of absence is an absence of evidence? So the human example, you can't have someone who's 100 feet tall, but once you bring it into a realm where it's kind of, there's an uncertainty whether it's outside that realm of possibility or if it's just many standard deviations away from what could be within the a possible framework.
I'm not sure that your reference to absence of evidence and evidence of absence is relevant here. The general answer to that question is when you have an expectation that if something is true, it will have such and such evidence, then absence of evidence is evidence of absence. If my keys are on the table, then when I walk into the room and look at the table, I'll see them. I know that because I know what the keys are, and I know my ability of my eyes, and I know the size of the table and everything else. So if they're really on the table, when I walk in, I'll see them. So if I go in, I don't see them, then they're not on the table. The absence of evidence, the absence of their vision on the table, is evidence that they're not on the table. So sometimes absence of evidence is evidence of absence, when the presence of the thing would be expected to leave behind or to present certain evidence. The trouble with studies like archaeology and others where they use this type of logic irresponsibly is that they often don't show you that if it's really there, the evidence should be this and this. They don't show you that. They just say, we looked and didn't find the evidence, so it must not be there. I remember in an archaeology book, they were looking for a particular biblical city, and they looked in 30 different places and didn't find it. It was in the 31st place. So they had no reason to say, if it really exists, it's going to be here. They didn't have that. That's where you have to beware and say, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
So is the key factor expectation, reasonable expectation?
That's right. That if the thing you're looking for would leave behind evidence, then when the evidence is missing, you then have evidence that it isn't there.
Okay.
That definitely happens.
Thank you.
But that's one thing. But then the other thing about standard deviations and everything else, you can calculate the tensile strength of bone, and you can calculate when you increase the diameter of the bone, how much the strength goes up, and you can calculate how much a human being would weigh if he was 100 feet tall, and it turns out that the bones break. They just can't carry it. So that's not a question of guesswork.
Yeah.
But if you didn't do that calculation, if you didn't know to do that calculation, if you didn't think of the bones breaking, then you wouldn't have known that it's impossible. Now, how do you know when you're thinking about something, and it seems okay to me, that you're not missing something like the bones or the surface area of the skin of the mosquito that's got to take in the oxygen? How do you know you're not missing something like that? That's the Rambam's question, and to this moment, there isn't a good answer to that question. So always the possibility that you're missing something which plays a role and you didn't realize that it's playing a role.
I think in the military they call that the unknown unknown.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. I mean, one of the American officials got in trouble. He said, it's not the known unknowns, but it's the unknown unknown. They made fun of him. And that's a profound statement, a very important, profound statement. We've got everything under control except for the unknown unknowns. Exactly right. Okay, so that's this what some people call the imagination. This thing. Okay, now you have the last two, which are really more crucial for us. One's action, and one that's the intellect. So the part of the soul that's related to action is the one where you have desires to possess, and disgust, which is a desire to be disconnected from something. And therefore, various actions will be rooted in this particular part of the soul, like, for example, seeking something out or fleeing from something, wanting to be in contact with something or wanting to be distant from something. Anger, and the word here is ratzon. Ratzon here doesn't mean will. It means being satisfied by something. Fear and boldness, because all of these qualities directly issue in action. Cruelty and mercy, love and hate. Many of the elements of the soul are elements that issue in action. That is to say, doing or holding back from doing, which can also be a kind of action. And of course, all the parts of the body are involved in this particular type of this element of the soul. And he gives examples. So this will be very important, because here's where will and decision making come into account. This is where the freedom of the will has to be explained, and therefore this particular fourth area is going to be very important for us. And finally comes what is translated either as the part that's the hegioni, which means mental, thought, or seichel, which means intelligence. Different translators have different ways of translating it to Hebrew. And here's where there's a kind of double subtlety that we have to take into account. What does this element of the soul do? What activities does it underlie? So he says, this part of the soul is what enables analysis, investigation, and through it he acquires wisdoms of various kinds, which he will classify in a moment. And through this part of the soul, he distinguishes between, now here there are different translations, but roughly it's good and bad among actions. Good and bad among actions. What things are good to do, what things are bad to do, right, wrong of actions. And right away, you understand that this is a very important part of morality. The Rambam is telling you that this part of the human soul possesses the ability to distinguish good from evil, moral good from moral evil. And he says this in the Laws of Tshuva, the 5th chapter, says it word for word. A human being knows from himself, from his own thought, good and evil. That's it. Created in him the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this has lots of consequences. I have spoken about it before in other contexts, but I will just summarize some of that material without going back through all the sources again. First of all, it means that potentially, anyway, all human beings have some knowledge of good and evil. Now, I say potentially because the Rambam's view, and I think it's also the modern view, is that what you have here is the capacity to develop certain powers if you undergo certain types of experiences. It's not that the newborn baby knows the difference between good and evil. But a normal newborn baby, if it undergoes certain experiences, will develop those powers. I'll give you an analogy. Let's take language. Normal newborn babies, if they undergo the normal type of childhood, end up speaking a language. There have been very tragic cases of disturbed parents who put a child in a closet, threw food into the closet, and the child was not exposed to language. It was discovered by the social services when the child was 8 or 10. The result is the child never learns a language like a first language. It never gets the fluency of language. There is what they call like a window of opportunity in the development of the brain where it's open to certain types of inputs which will then result in its acquiring a language, and then after a certain age that closes. So you can't do that anymore. And if the child isn't exposed to language in the appropriate period of time, then he never develops the capacity of a first language. So it could be that the child was born perfectly normal, but its normal birth gives it the capacity to develop linguistic ability if it's exposed to certain experiences. It's not born speaking. And the same thing is true with good and evil. The same thing is true with mathematics. The same thing is true with a lot of things that human beings. And this, by the way, has parallels in the animal world. They did terrible studies with kitten vision. I call it terrible because half the kittens ended up blind, where there's a certain window of developing sight, and if you deprive the kitten of the normal set of activities, then it never develops sight, just remains blind. So when we say that the human being is given the capacity to know good and evil, it means given the capacity to develop the concepts of good and evil if it has a normal set of activities. That's one point. The second point is, when we talk about good and evil, that has to be divided and sort of classified. When you think about, let's say, deciding what to do, in any practical situation, one thing that guides you is your rules of morality, what's right and wrong. I made a promise, I have to keep it. He left his book in my house, I have to return it. I have money set aside for charity. This person is in need of support, so I give him charity. There are various things that my moral rules tell me it's right or wrong to do. If, for example, I'm a trained physician, then one of the things that's right for me to do is to improve people's health. But then I also need to know the facts of the matter. Sure, I have money set aside for charity, but does he really need charity? Or maybe he's just pretending to be poor. And he's not needy. And then whether it's right or wrong to give him the money doesn't depend just on my moral rules of giving charity. Depends upon whether this is a charity case. And if you're a doctor and you care about people's health, what about your medical knowledge? Maybe your medical knowledge is incorrect. And then with all your virtue that you want to help people, you're really hurting them, like the medical profession until 150 years ago when they systematically bled people who had fevers because they thought that that would help their health, and then they discovered that it doesn't help, and in fact it hurts. So we don't do it anymore. So those people, 200 years ago, those doctors who bled people with fevers had all the right intentions, but they were actually hurting people. What they were doing wasn't right to do. So there's a big difference between knowing the moral rules on the one hand and knowing what needs to be done in a concrete circumstance on the other hand. Concrete circumstance leans both on your moral rules and your knowledge of the world. So when the Rambam says that people are created with the ability to develop an understanding of good and evil if they go through the right experiences, that just means of the moral rules. It doesn't mean that if they go through the right circumstances, they're automatically going to get knowledge of what needs to be done in practical circumstances. Many of the debates that we have about moral decisions are really debates about the practical circumstances and the expected results. And the reason why this is important, a reason why this is important to keep in mind, is because people fantasize that there are wide moral gaps between societies, and even within societies, wide moral gaps between various different social and political orientations, when usually that's not the case. Usually what they disagree about is the associated facts. Different economic systems. So raising the minimum wage, is that compassion for the poor, or is it driving the poor out of the workforce because people will look to automate with machines and won't employ them? It's not a question that one is compassionate, the other is not compassionate. The question is, what will do best for the poor? And that's a factual disagreement, not a moral disagreement. So the Rambam here is only talking about moral principles. And then an application, what I said at the outset, this is only if you have the standard set of experiences. But if you have what we would call a non-standard set of experiences, then that can stunt the growth of these capacities, or warp the growth of these capacities, similar to the child who was kept in a closet until he was 8, doesn't develop language. I'm told that the obscene cruelty that Hamas demonstrated on October 7th, which to a certain extent I would say implies a gap of humanity, is not unique to Hamas. There are whole regions of the world where this kind of cruelty is normal, practiced widely in different societies, neighboring one another when they fight wars and so forth and so on. So there's a whole section of two-legged, 2 feet, 2 eyes, upright posture, which lack in what we would call basic humanity. I'm not convinced by the relativist jargon that that's their culture. I think a lack of basic humanity can be described as such when it applies to two-legged creatures that have upright posture. So that means that their social norms and their normal pattern of activity and that impact that it has on growing children, that is something which warps what the Rambam is talking about as the basic humanity. There is a country in the world where the slogan is, "You're not a man until you have killed a man and made a man. Wow. That's what makes you a man. That's not a human man. That's not a human man. That's animal. That's just animal. That's what wolves do. Till you kill a man and make a man, that's what makes you a man. There's a basic failure of humanity there. So that warped type of experience isn't going to bring about the development of the understanding of good and evil that the Rambam was talking about. Yeah.
Will the non-standard experience also work in the opposite direction and not just warp that power of the soul, but in a negative sense, but in a positive sense, that your non-standard experience is so far removed from standard experience that you can perceive things that otherwise would not be perceivable through a normal standard experience?
You know, they used to make a joke out of this. Was Einstein normal? Well, let's see now. Was he normal? You know, being in the 1/100th of 1% of the top intelligence of the whole human race? Is that the norm? Is that the usual? The ordinary? Certainly not. Would you call him a special needs person? Yeah, he needs special challenges and special instruction because of the enormity of his. So, if that's what you mean, that you could have something which is very unusual, which gives you a heightened sensitivity, that I think that's quite right. But usually we would qualify that by saying it includes all of the rest and has more in addition. Not that it is in place of the rest.
So would it be in that example, it's coming through more the nature side, the nurture, through the experience of cultivating it or being exposed to just one's upbringing? Could it be brought about? Because in that case, he would be his genetics, so to speak, that influenced it.
Okay, nature and nurture is a fluctuating fashion in social sciences, but every 15 or 20 years the balance tips the other way, and no one really knows how it works. No one can predict how it works. It's more intellectual fashions than it is research. When you talk about the social sciences, the word sciences should be in scare quotes. You know, social sciences, and if you take a look at Retraction Watch, which is a website which looks at all the papers that were published in journals in general, especially psychology journals, which had to be retracted because they made the splash and then they were taken back. Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for behavioral economics, wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and he described a certain type of mental mistake in analyzing data. He himself made that mistake in his book. He wrote a piece about it after called Trainwreck. So, you really understand these things? Yeah, he got the Nobel Prize. Surely he understands it. Until he makes exactly the same mistake. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's really not worth and of course we don't know all the ones that are going to be retracted tomorrow. Yeah.
So there's like some sort of building, psychological building, let's say, that if it's somehow built with like let's say perverse principles, most of the times it produces all these like horrendous people that we've seen.
Yeah.
But also rarely there's like awakening amongst them, very rarely, that somehow like higher qualities arise in them. So it's like that would be like some sort of idea of that there's like a deeper human principle that could somehow even flow in.
That's a very interesting point. That I think we do have, you have societies that are regimented, but usually in a fairly large population, you'll have some people who respond to the regimented upbringing in unique ways. Sometimes rebellious ways, or sometimes just ways that take account of other sensitivities which they weren't taught to do. I think we don't really understand how human beings function. I mentioned that before, and I think you're right. That does happen. So, as I said before, the nature-nurture thing is so difficult to pin down. So I don't think you can make confident assignments to one or the other, and certainly don't make them on the basis of the science section of the New York Times. God Almighty! I lived through the gene for homosexuality, and it was on the front page for years and years, and so on and so on. I saw a headline maybe a year ago. The current thinking is that genetics plays about a 10% a role in determining the sexual orientation of people. 10%. That's not exactly having it determined like your eye color, is it? Not exactly. So not only was it premature, but it was politically motivated and politically hidden. And this was, for a long time on the page 62. It wasn't given the same press because it doesn't play the same political role. The whole thing is corrupt. Okay, so now the Rambam wants to make a double point here. I guess I have time to introduce it today, and then I'll have to elaborate it some more. He talks about the nefesh being the tzura of what possesses that nefesh. We said there's the human nefesh and the horse nefesh and the palm tree nefesh. The nefesh is the tzura. Tzura is roughly form, whatever that means. So now we have this nefesh that we described for the human being, which has these 5 parts. That nefesh is the tzura of what? It's like if the body is the material of the human being, and this nefesh is the tzura, the form of the human being, and an item is composed of material and form. So when you put them together, you get a human being. But in the case of a human being, at least, the nefesh itself, he says, has its own tzura. Not that it is a tzura, but it has a tzura. And vis-a-vis that tzura, the nefesh now plays the role of material. So the nefesh, vis-a-vis the body, plays the role of tzura, and vis-a-vis that super tzura plays the role of material. And what is that super tzura? So here, the translations are mixed, and because they're mixed, there's a little confusion. For example, one translation is seichel, which sounds like intelligence, and another translation is das. Das is not intelligence. Das is knowledge. And here you have 2 different pictures of a human being. What did the Greeks say? Lahavdil, in their grand mistaken philosophy, that a human being is a rational animal. Rationality is the capacity of thinking, what we sometimes call intelligence, the capacity of understanding what rules are appropriate for drawing conclusions. Knowledge isn't that at all. Knowledge is the result of exercising rationality and arriving at a conclusion. Rationality is a procedure that results in knowledge. So is the tzura, the form, the capacity to find knowledge through rational investigation, which you might call intellect? Or is it the produced knowledge? And if you look elsewhere in the Rambam, it's absolutely clear that it's the produced knowledge, not the intellect. The intellect is a tool which produces the tzura of the human being. What you go into the world with, what you take with you as your medium of contact with the Kadosh Baruch Hu is your knowledge, not your intellect. Because Baruch Hu is not going to be putting clever intellectual problems for you to solve in the world to come. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is you'll have a certain knowledge, and with that knowledge you'll relate to him. So now what we have to describe is how the nefesh of the human being is by itself the tzura to the body, but it itself is unformed until it possesses its tzura, which is knowledge. And I'll give you a couple of parallels to try to explain the idea. Now, in talking about these parallels, I'm going to use vocabulary. And the vocabulary is the subject of vast philosophical investigation and controversy. I'm not going to do that here. This isn't a philosophy class. And besides, this area of philosophy is not one that I was trained in and I'm not expert in. So I'm going to use the terms, and I know that they're vague, and I know that there's certain contradictions that can be raised. We're all aware of that. That's not the job that we're doing here. I just want to get some picture across to you. So let's take, for example, first of all, how the nefesh is the tzura of the body. And this applies to horses as well. Well, first of all, the nefesh is what gives the body life. It's the nefesh that enlivens the body. So, of course, a dead body doesn't do anything. A dead body is useless to it itself and useless to anybody else, lest it's carrion to be eaten by dogs. So the nefesh, by giving it life, this is sort of like plugging an electrical appliance into the socket on the wall. It's unplugged, it's dead. Doesn't do anything. Electricity makes it functional. So tzura here is something which makes something functional. Now, you take a look at the heart in the body. The heart in the body is a pump. It's supposed to pump and circulate the blood. But if it's not alive, it doesn't pump anything, and it doesn't circulate. So you look at the body and you see the heart as a pump, but you see it's not pumping. And if you know that its connection to the nefesh, which is enabled it to pump, then the tzura here is playing the role of giving the thing its functionality. This use of tzura is quite similar to the more primitive uses of tzura. Let's say you have wooden planks, and they are assembled in the form of a chair. That's where we talk, right? They're assembled in the form of a chair. Tzura is form. So this chair is made out of wood, but the fact that it's a chair is the fact of the form that it has. Take the planks apart, and you can put them in another way, and it'll be a table. Take the planks apart another way, and it's kindling for a fire. So the tzura gives the functionality to the material, and different tzuras will give it their functionality. I suppose the planks of wood can be used to make arrows, to shoot. The tzura determines the functionality. So in this sense, also the nefesh determines the functionality enables the functionality to exist of the body to which it's attached. This presupposes that you can look at things and see their functionality. You know, the heart pumps blood around the body, and the heart also goes thump, 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 thump. But we don't think of the heart as a thump, thump machine. We think of the heart as a pump to pump the blood. So there's a lot of philosophy devoted to explaining how you identify functions and functions without designers. But we all agree that the function of the heart is not to make thump, thump sounds, but to pump the blood. And it's the nefesh which enlivens it so that it will perform that function. So similarly, the human nefesh enlivens the body. All of the functions of the body, what the Rambam told us, are enlivened by the nefesh of the human being. And in that way, the nefesh of the human being brings functionality, real operating functionality, not just potential functionality that you have in a dead body, real operating functionality to the body, and that way it gives the body its condition under which it can function the way it ought to function. Now, one of the elements in this nefesh is the logical part, the intellectual part. Part of the soul, the part of the nefesh, is the part that reasons, the part that investigates, the part that analyzes, the part that draws conclusions. That's the part of the soul, which is the raw material for the end product, the raw material of the end product, which is knowledge. So one of the things that the human being does in functioning in the world is reasoning. You know, I've got to eat supper and the refrigerator's empty. What shall I do? Go to the store, order online, call up my brother-in-law and ask him to bring over supper. There are a lot of things I can do to get supper. So that's what the reasoning faculty does. But the reasoning faculty itself is raw material for a higher tzura. That higher tzura is knowledge. And as he will say, knowledge of a particular type. And when it possesses knowledge of that particular type, then it has achieved its function. The function of the logical part, intellectual part of the human being is not primarily to get supper. That's the function of the logical part of animals. And then when it achieves that tzura of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that it achieves then dictates what the body should be doing to fulfill its highest possible function. And that's going to be something which is utterly divorced from animals. Animals don't have that. So that's this double function of the nefesh of the human being as being the tzura of the body and also being the material for the tzura of knowledge. I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow, but that's the basic idea that I wanted to introduce.